Today on the Perception and Action podcast, a look at a couple papers on a coach's role within the constraints-led approach. Is the role of the coach simply to design constraints manipulations and get out of the way, or is there more to it than that? Does a coach need to adapt too? What is the role of verbal instruction in the CLA? So it's time for a call to action. Well, I'm back. I apologize for my unannounced month off from podcasting. Things got kind of crazy with travel and work, and the month of June just kind of got away from me. But I have lots of interesting stuff coming soon, so hopefully you stuck with me. Today, I want to revisit the topic of the role of the coach in the CLA. This is something I've been dealing with a lot myself over the last couple of years. While most coaches quickly grasp the idea of constraints and self-organization, it takes much, much longer for them to fully understand the logic and how to use the CLA for a particular individual. For example, in the past, it's not been uncommon for me to demo a constraint like the connection ball for baseball pitchers and then come back the next day to see it being used by everyone. It takes a while to understand the individualization of constraints, and it's not just copy and paste like traditional methods in coaching. So I thought this topic would be relevant to revisit.
Hi everyone, this is Rob Gray from Arizona State University and PerceptionAction.com. Welcome to the Perception and Action podcast, where I discuss how psychological research can be applied to improving performance, accelerating skill acquisition, and designing technologies. On this episode, I want to look at the very challenging issue of how to coach effectively within the constraints-led approach, or CLA. The CLA, which I discussed in detail in the three-part series beginning with episode 87, is something that I think is continuing to appeal to a lot of coaches, but using it effectively can be challenging. What should you be doing as a coach if you're not providing movement solutions and constantly stepping in and correcting and giving feedback? Is your job now to design a constraint, then step back and stay out of the way as the athlete self-organizes? Or is there more to it than that? Let's have a look at a couple of recent papers that have addressed these issues. First off, I want to look at an article published recently by Orth, Vanderkamp, and Button in the journal Physical Education and Sport Pedagogy. The authors of this paper begin by giving a brief overview of the CLA in ecological dynamics. As a brief reminder, in the CLA, skill is viewed as an emergent property that occurs while solving movement problems that have individual task and environmental constraints. Skill acquisition is underpinned by a process of self-organization, which can over short, medium, or longer time frames enhance the individual environment fit. Critically, in the CLA, the coach does not need to prescribe the ideal movement pattern or solution to the learner over time to enforce learning. Instead of being prescriptive, information is used as a resource to guide exploration and action. A key aspect of acquiring a new skill involves the discovery of affordances by attuning to information that provides opportunities for action. Thus, where traditional approaches to coaching might emphasize the substance in explaining the development of a skill, the CLA emphasizes process. So where does the coach fit in all of this? If you look at textbooks and papers on the CLA, the coach has typically been characterized as a monitor and manipulator of constraints on the learner. Quote from the paper: "A primary role of the coach in supporting learning via CLA involves the manipulation of constraints in a facilitative manner in order to encourage variability and exploratory learning." And quote, "Coaches and teachers need to discover ways to manipulate the informational constraints on learners during practice." Finally, quote, "Identifying the key rate limiters to current performance is a key skill for teachers and coaches to determine what aspect of performance that an individual or team needs to work on at a specific stage of their development." End quote. In essence, the coach is a designer whose role is to shape constraints such that practice consistently improves the learner's capabilities to perform in a range of different contexts. As the authors of this paper point out, even if constraints manipulations performed by a coach are not necessarily prescriptive, this viewpoint suggests that the effective coach acts as a change agent, who, through constraints manipulation, can orchestrate the learning process. From this description, it's not surprising that many have now developed the view that the coach within the CLA is relatively disengaged and at worst absent in the learning process, where the primary role is the gatekeeper to variability in constraints and behavior. You design the constraints, then get out of the way. Thus, at first impression, the CLA does not appear to explicitly represent the coach. the coach is not really considered as being part of the learning environment. Rather, in the CLA, the coach's role in the learning process may appear relatively disengaged or overly passive, with coaches becoming too hands-off. As the authors point out, this was likely a necessary response to more traditional approaches to encourage coaches not to override the self-organization processes. Another issue that I'm sure many coaches that have tried to adopt the CLA can sympathize with is there seems to be very little discussion so far about how exactly coaches discover, identify, and manipulate constraints in a manner skillfully adapted to the learner over time. To manipulate constraints effectively, the coach must understand the unique intrinsic dynamics of individuals. That is, the set of movement capabilities that each individual brings. Quote, expert coaches have significant levels of experiential knowledge in assessing an athlete's intrinsic dynamics, creating timely interventions that prevent too much stability in performance, deliberately creating instability in practice environments by manipulating control parameters leads to the development of performers with high levels of adaptability who can choose from a range of stable, functional movement patterns. But how does a coach develop this ability? In discussing constraints manipulations, Orth and colleagues also emphasize the distinction between systematic and unsystematic constraints manipulations. For example, in basketball, a systematic manipulation of constraints can lead to exploration of different coordination solutions. That is, the way angles and joints are constrained to become clearly different. And control solutions. The remaining degrees of freedoms are parameterized to optimize performance further. For example, at a close distance to the basket, individuals tend to use a layup style in basketball, while at far distances they might transition to use more of a throwing style of action. By contrast, if the distance is not changed but the lateral position is modified, the individual is encouraged to explore the same coordination solution but vary control. For example, the shooter might begin to explore different ways of positioning their hands on the ball. Thus, the coach can systematically change the constraints to emphasize either coordination or control. This is something I discussed back in episode 91. Unsystematic manipulations of constraints, on the other hand, involve constant and random variation in task environmental constraints during practice. In the basketball example, the coach could randomly and constantly vary distances, orientations, ball sizes, types, weights, surface characteristics, hoop size, height, and so on. Unsystematic approaches use random variation to support the individual's exploration of system degeneracy. That is, alternative ways to solve the same movement problem. In this case, random changes in the constraints may support exploration and adaptability. For instance, randomness may help prevent the individual from becoming trapped in a false minima. That is, a solution that is limited in scope. Also, when practicing a particular skill, the presence of randomness requires constant adaptation. This facilitates practice closer to repetition without repetition on the part of the learner, helping them to become better attuned to important information for supporting adaptive actions. Whilst the CLA advocates variations of constraints as a basis for designing practice, the type of constraints manipulated are not random and are informed by the principles of representative design. But again, how does a coach learn to use this effectively? In sum, as the CLA is often currently discussed, there are some basic theoretical and practical problems. From a theoretical standpoint, even if a constraint manipulation is not necessarily prescriptive, the current viewpoint suggests the effective coach acts as an agent and gatekeeper to variability in constraints and behavior. The coach, through constraint manipulation, causes learning in the learners. Notably, there's no clear or active role for the learner in this process, as he or she is merely captured or enslaved within a system of constraints. From a practical viewpoint, there's been very little discussion of how the coach develops as a constraints manipulator. Quote, in the description thus far of the coach as a constraints manipulator, the coach is relatively disengaged. He or she is simply the manager of the learning environment, manipulating and controlling it based on their prediction of the learner's internal dynamics. The coach is not really considered as being a co-adaptive component of the learning environment. This is, in many respects, a dissatisfying portrait of how coaches actually interact with the learner or shape constraints during practice. The learner and coach constitute a learning system. In this case, both are components of the learning system, and changes in either can result in learning. To address these issues, Orth and colleagues argue that we need to put the coach back in the learning system. Coaching is a context-specific and social process that is also emergent. Consistent with this idea, previous research has shown that effective coaches' activities were primarily characterized by exploratory behaviors, including observation of athletes, collecting information on the current context, listening to the athletes, interpreting events to develop different hypotheses to explain changes in performance. Also described were sequences which involved interventions aimed at helping the athletes. For example, by providing a range of informational constraints to orient the athlete on a particular point, which I'll talk about more in the second half of this episode. Note, the presence of exploratory behavior in coach behavior is reminiscent of exploratory behavior used by athletes to generate and tune to information that can be adapted, suggesting exploration as a common mechanism toward adaptivity and learning. Smith and Cushion have described the coaching process as a cycle of spontaneous and reactive behavior, where periods of silence were interspersed with feedback, praise, or encouragement. This reveals one way in which coaches become skilled, primarily through direct experience, as opposed to being objective and decontextualized. Orth and colleagues emphasize that the key principle guiding a coach through this exploration process should be representative learning design. In setting up constraints to interact in a manner representative of the performance context, coaches facilitate opportunities to adapt skills that will also emerge in the setting the learner seeks to perform. Applying these ideas to coach development and learning, they can be taken to mean that representative design also has an effect on the development of a coach's skill and their capability to transfer their skill to the athlete. So, overall, I think the article makes some very important points about the role of the coach and adaptation of the coaching process within. Obviously, we now need more research to understand the best ways to facilitate this adaptation and development, but I think the central message that a coach is more than just a passive designer in the CLA is a very important one. The other article that I want to look at today is one currently in press by Batista and colleagues. Within the CLA, I find that many people assume that there's absolutely no room for explicit verbal instructions on the part of the coach. Your job is just to stand back and not say anything and let the athlete self-organize. As I've tried to emphasize in the past, this is simply not the case. One of the key skills a coach needs to possess in the CLA is the ability to help athletes focus their attention on the key elements, the affordances, within the task they're doing. And one of the main ways that this can be achieved is through varying the initial instructions used when manipulating constraints. For example, previous research has shown that manipulation of the initial instruction in basketball, whether it's neutral, risky, or conservative, promoted changes in interpersonal relationships among players and affected the way players explored space during one-on-one basketball tasks. As the authors of this current paper point out, in fact, initial instructions is one of the constraints most commonly used by coaches when describing and defining the exercise aim and reinforcing the main possibilities for play. For that, task manipulation and initial instruction should be aligned with the strategic ideas of the coach to promote the transfer of team behaviors from training to the competitive game environment. The aim of this current study was to assess the effect of coaches' strategic instruction on defensive and offensive performance in football small-sided games. Semi-professional football players were divided into two 7-a-side balanced competitive teams. Both teams received instructions regarding the rules of the small-sided games. Additionally, one team received instructions from the coach regarding the individual and collective tactical behavior required for each exercise. There were 3 conditions. 1, without strategic instruction for either team. 2, defensive strategy. And 3, offensive strategy. In the without strategy exercise, both teams only received instructions regarding the rules of the small-sided game. In the defensive strategy exercise, one team was instructed to maintain the team compactness in the inner zones of the field in order to regain ball possession and explore counterattacks to win the game. Finally, in the offensive strategy exercise, the instructed team was required to maintain ball possession and to only attack when a clear advantage was created. The technical actions of the players were registered using a notational analysis system and GPS. What was found? The comparison between the without and defensive strategy revealed higher number of defensive actions, less space covered, and more distance covered in jogging for defensive in comparison with without. The comparison between without and offensive revealed more passes per ball possession, larger team length, larger space covered, lower distance covered walking, and more distance covered in jogging for offensive versus without strategy. Overall, these results show that teams in which only without strategy was used, the training task did not change the technical, tactical, and external loads of the performances. These results confirm that the use of a coach's strategic, defensive, or offensive instruction can strain the technical, tactical, and physical performance of players and teams. This is because the use of strategic instruction can constrain the way players perceive their own teammates and actions and can educate their attention to different affordances.
Okay, that's it for today's episode. Remember, you can contact me at robgray@asu.edu or follow me on Twitter at ShakyWeights. To find out more about the podcast, please check out perceptionaction.com. Finally, to support the podcast and receive bonus materials, including a monthly coaches meetup, please head over to patreon.com/perceptionaction. This is Rob Gray from ASU. Cheers for now, and keep 'em coupled.
Gone straight away.